This meeting is being recorded.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another event. This is our first event co-sponsored with the Haywood Cannon Caucus of the IWW. Today, we're joined by Professor Bryan Palmer. He is a historian of labor and the left. He has written extensively on the history of the United States dissident communism, publishing two of a projected 3-volume history of the life and times of James P Cannon, founder of American Trotskyism, as well as the history of the Minneapolis Teamsters strikes in 1934. Most recently, he has published a 2-volume history of colonialism and capitalism in Canada from 1500 to the present. The author, co-author, or editor of more than 25 volumes, he has taught in Canada and the United States and lectured to intellectual and political audiences throughout the world. With that said, Bryan's going to do his presentation, and afterwards we'll open it up to a question and answer period. And anybody who has a question, just type it in the chat box, and we'll read them off and just keep going until we're tired. All right. With that, I'll pass it off to Bryan.
Okay. Thanks very much to the Virginia Worker for hosting this, and for all of you who are here. I'd first ask is the image and the audio okay on your end now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to talk today about James P Cannon, whose work and significance in the history of the American labor movement and the left I've been working on since the mid-1990s. And I've published 2 of projected 3 volumes on Cannon. The first volume, James P. Cannon and the Origins of the American Revolutionary Left, 1890 to 1928, covered his early years, which included his time in the IWW and his fundamental role in the 1920s, being the founding chair of the American Communist Party, until he was expelled from that party late in 1928 for aligning with Trotsky and his critique of an emerging Stalinism within the Soviet Union and its impact around the world, and in terms of its the way it was deforming communist parties and national sections of the Comintern. The second volume on James P. Cannon and the American Trotskyism from 1928 to 1938 looks at what I would argue were the sort of heroic and most influential years of American Trotskyism and Cannon's decisive role in founding the Socialist Workers' Party in 1938, but also in sort of negotiating the very difficult project of both breaking from Stalinism, maintaining a perspective on communism and the possibilities of revolutionary class struggle in the advanced capitalist nations of the West, of which the United States was the preeminent nation state. And the necessity of building a class struggle proletarian party to carry through the prospects and possibilities of building socialism in a way that both encompassed the original insights and sensibilities and impulses of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky, but rejected the growing bureaucratization and ossification of the Comintern under Stalin. In a sense, my own political history is one that sort of, I suppose, determined my willingness and interest in spending decades of my life writing about Cannon. I came out of the 1960s. Like many new left radicals, I gravitated first to Maoism, then broke from it, and after a period of sort of looking at the possibilities of anarcho-syndicalism, gravitated instead towards Trotskyism. And my interest in Cannon stemmed from the realization that Cannon was, as the founder of American Trotskyism, in some senses, a representative of the best traditions of the American revolutionary left. He is a red thread of continuity that connects through his father, who was a member of the Knights of Labor and a Debs socialist in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Um, Cannon learned from him and read The Appeal to Reason and other newspapers that came out of that Midwestern tradition of American socialism, which was embedded in the working class of places like Kansas City, where he grew up. And in Kansas, Cannon gravitated as a teenager, really, and a working class teenager who, in Rosedale, Kansas, where he grew up, had a very difficult, but typically working class upbringing, marginal, economically precarious. He obviously had in high school attractions towards learning, debating, intellectual life, and politics, but had to quit high school after a time and secure work in packing houses and railroad shops because his family was in pretty dire circumstances. And his father, by that point, had a number of friends who were in the IWW and introduced him to soapboxers, itinerant radicals, the whole part of the hobo culture of the IWW in Kansas City. And Cannon was drawn to that culture and to the defense of political prisoners, which by the time of 1906-07, when Cannon would have been approximately 16 years of age, the key case involved of political prisoners involved figures from the Western Federation of Miners, like Bill Haywood, who were falsely accused of an assassination attempt on the governor, I think, of the state of Idaho. And freeing political prisoners became a central activity that Cannon, as a teenager, was involved in. He gravitated from that to be a distinguished soapboxer in Kansas City, and he came under the tutelage in Chicago of Vincent St. John, who was one of the leading figures in the IWW, a centralizer who challenged the IWW's elements that really promoted and advocated decentralization. St. John believed in a leadership, and that leadership, however, he also felt its duty was and job was to really educate, mentor, and school young, up and coming activists and militants, teaching them the ropes, and then basically trusting in their capacity to grow into leadership positions. And when Cannon came under St. John's tutelage in Chicago, it wasn't long before St. John sent him out on the road to be a hobo agitator, where Cannon led free speech fights in Peoria, Illinois, was active in major strikes in rubber works in Akron, Ohio, worked at the Pennsylvania offices of one of the major wobbly newspapers, Solidarity, where he had a small column in which he called Cannonballs. And in all of this, Cannon was basically becoming and embracing the politics of revolution. He had been a member of the Socialist Party, as many Wobblies were, prior to his full-scale commitment to the Wobblies, and he found the Socialist Party circa 1908, 1909, a pretty tepid organization, one that he thought was composed unduly of fairly moderate socialists, often with class backgrounds quite removed in their sort of petty bourgeois character from the class experiences that he himself came out of and lived, and that he himself wanted to intersect with and interact with, and in some senses to lead in the direction of revolutionary class struggle activities. In all of this, Cannon was a young man. He was unmarried. He had no children. That changed. He went back to high school after a number of years of working. He was older. He actually fell in love with and developed a relationship with his high school teacher, a Finnish radical. They had two children, and by the time that war broke out, Cannon, still a committed Wobbly, had joined what is often called the Home Guard within the Wobblies. Those people, those men largely who were tied down by family obligations, children, etc. And Cannon lived in Kansas City. He was active with Earl Browder in various syndicalist organizations, and really, but focused inevitably on a very different life than the itinerant sort of rail hopping hobo agitator that he had been earlier. These were difficult years for Cannon, as they were for many militants during the World War, because radical ideas were very much sort of reduced one to a persona non grata among one's comparable but less political figures in the working class, and faced the possibility of repression and coercion from employers and local political figures, etc. War, and then 1917, that period from 1914 to 1918, in some senses transformed Cannon, as it did transform the revolutionary left globally. Cannon was fond of saying later in life that he was a Wobbly who had learned something. And what he had learned was very much a product of these 1914 to 1918 years. First, the war. The war really seared into Cannon's consciousness the extent to which the IWW had really a very decisive shortcoming in its programmatic approach to working class revolution. Cannon never relinquished and always admired the Wobblies' instinctual commitment to the class struggle. Its preamble, of course, had declared that the employing class and the working class have nothing in common. And the IWW lived that axiom and fought as the most militant fighters within the working class, and put to shame the more sort of conservatizing, bureaucratic, and accommodationist approach of Sam Gomper's the AFL, and certain elements within the craft union tradition. But what war highlighted to Cannon was that the Wobblies really had no perspective on how to interact with workers in a time of war, and how to bring them into a class struggle politics that actually opposed capitalist war and opposed the repression and coercion that war inevitably generated and cultivated in terms of xenophobia and the sort of bellicose nationalisms and chauvinisms that war cultivates and nurtures and in some senses depends upon. During the war, the Wobblies came under intense repression. There were a series of criminal syndicalist trials, the most notable being in Chicago, where Haywood and I think 117 other IWW members were hauled before the courts and charged with criminal syndicalist activities. But there were also other trials in California and I think in Wheatland in the Midwest. And what Cannon noticed was the Wobblies had no coordinated approach to how to defend their the class struggle victims, their members who were being tried and convicted in the bourgeois courts of this period. And he looked around and he saw that an emerging left wing in the Socialist Party could actually galvanize, meetings of tens and across the country of hundreds of thousands of workers opposed to war. And the IWW was simply foundering in this sort of inability to confront the class politics of the state as it manifested itself in a time of intense inter-imperialist rivalries. The other event, of course, which galvanized Cannon and so many others, including many Wobblies, the Wobblies would come to have a very almost a split approach to the Russian Revolution of 1917, and they did see, quite rightly under Stalin, the increasing bureaucratization. But many Wobblies resisted the importance of the Russian Revolution because they did not see the necessity of the political struggle as opposed to the struggle at the point of production in bringing about revolutionary transformation. What the Russian Revolution revealed was, in Cannon's view, the necessity of a disciplined combat working class party, a proletarian vanguard that could exercise a decisive influence in moments of potential social transformation. So he was drawn to the Russian Revolution and its capacities to build what looked like in 1917 the potential of a true workers' republic, of a true socialist society. Now, the combination of this realization that the capacity to fight war and to intersect with anti-war militants in the working class, and the importance of the Russian Revolution and the significance of a party, also drew Cannon more and more towards Marxism and towards internationalism, which would be fundamental touchstones of his entire political career and trajectory in the years after 1917. And so in this moment, what Cannon did was he went back into the Socialist Party, which at the time of 1918, 1919, was fractured along left-wing and right-wing lines. And the right wing was dominant, and it was certainly quite conservative. They had, after all, drummed Haywood and others out of the Socialist Party. Haywood had been a member earlier on as well. But Cannon struggled to build the left wing inside the Socialist Party. And he was one of the very few who had what one could consider working class credentials, that he had led class struggles, that he had been intimate friends with working class militants like Frank Little in the IWW. He had learned from them in struggles in Duluth among, dockers and iron ore workers. And so Cannon was part of a proletarian contingent and a fairly rare and numerically quite constricted proletarian contingent within the left wing of the Socialist Party, which included people like John Reed and Louis Freyna. And from there, Cannon, fought as these people did to push the Socialist Party towards a more revolutionary and left course. They lost that struggle. And as they lost that struggle and found themselves expelled and rejected from the Socialist Party, Cannon gravitated with people like Reed and Freyna to the underground, and Charles Ruthenberg from Ohio, to the underground communist movement that was emerging. It too was fractured and fragmented. And Cannon's decisive role, and here he really matured as a revolutionary. His decisive role in the period from roughly 1919 into 1921 was to bring together, in some senses, divided and fractured elements of this underground communist milieu, which included foreign language sections of Jews, Germans, Finns, to bring together those foreign language sections with a contingent of native-born, as Cannon was, although he came from Irish ancestry, native-born American radicals and revolutionaries. And Cannon knit together really a coalition that had to fight against an undergroundist, often Russian-led element within the underground communist milieu that wanted to keep the communist movement so deeply underground that it was inevitably isolated from intervening in working class struggles across the United States, and incapable really of breaking out of this sort of very marginal and clandestine existence of an underground movement. Cannon felt that bourgeois democracy in the United States, while a sham, afforded revolutionaries capacities to engage in mass work with the working class that far exceeded anything that was possible in the Bolshevik experience in Russia, where Tsarism had been far more repressive, and there were remnants of almost feudal and aristocratic governance that really closed the door on open agitation among the workers. And Cannon won that struggle, and he won that struggle with the support of early Comintern leaders like Lenin and Trotsky, who thought that what needed to be done was to create an above-ground communist party that could, in fact, really serve as the vanguard of an American working class that had to be introduced to the kind of Marxism and the politics of revolutionary transformation that were increasingly becoming available to radicals and revolutionaries like Cannon, Earl Browder, and others. I mean, when Cannon was in the IWW, he said his understanding of Marxism was pretty much restricted to a couple of pamphlets that had been circulated by the Socialist Labor Party, led by Daniel de Leon, the most notable of which was Wage, Labor, and Capital. So the Marxism of Cannon prior to his shift into the socialist left wing of the Socialist Party and the Communist Underground had been pretty rudimentary. And that changed as he read more widely and as he engaged in theoretical discussions with people inside the Communist Underground, but also in later years in the Communist International when he made a number of trips to the Soviet Union. Cannon was, in fact, his stature was so high that he was the founding chairman, in our terms today, of the Workers' Party, the first Communist Party in the United States in 1921. And he was over the course of the 1920s, he would become one of the leader of one of the three factions that was in a highly factionalized American Communist Party. He led a faction that was really a labor faction, but also a labor political defense faction. And his sort of bastion, his area of control, was the International Labor Defense, the ILD, which was dedicated to the committed to the struggle to release political prisoners, to support political prisoners, class struggle political prisoners when they were jailed, to support their families. And Cannon, after consultations with Haywood in Moscow in the early to mid 1920s, founded the International Labor Defense Organization and rallied around him a group of committed labor activists and militants within the CP, particularly drawing on youthful figures like Martin Aburn and Max Shachtman. And his then wife, his second wife, Rose Carstner, was very active in all of this work as well. As were a number of other figures like Bill Dunn and Tom O'Flaherty, who were part of a kind of proletarian, hard-drinking, and militant class struggle advocates. Cannon was the leader of this contingent, this faction, and he sat on all of the major committees of the American Communist Party throughout the 1920s. The other figures, the more political and office-centered faction was centered around J. Lovestone and Charles Ruthenberg. And William Z. Foster led a more trade union-oriented faction. And Foster and Cannon would have some collaboration, often, tying themselves together in opposition to the more sort of egregious, what they felt were the more egregious errors and inclinations of particularly the Lovestone faction after Ruthenberg died in 1926. Among the campaigns that Cannon played a fundamental role in as head of the ILD, for instance, was the defense of two anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, who were sent to the electric chair in 1927, I believe. The factionalism of the Communist Party wore Cannon down. By 1927 and early 1928, Cannon was actually unsure if he was going to continue in his leadership role as a major factional figure. He had not been critical of the emerging assault on Trotsky within the Comintern, thinking that it was outside of his main area of interest, which was the class struggle in the United States. He'd actually voted with a number of anti-Trotskyist motions that were basically filtered down from the Comintern into the American Party and its leading political committees. And what Cannon was increasingly disillusioned with was the factionalism that he couldn't really understand, and the way in which it was basically handcuffing and limiting the possibilities of class struggle and a kind of united political, industrial, and social and cultural work that he felt the Communist Party needed to be doing to actually win workers over. So Cannon, by the late 1920s, 27, 28, was in some senses questioning his own leadership and perhaps his own role and commitment to the Communist Party, and was thinking of scaling back his activities. His faction had to push him to go to a Comintern meeting in 1928, the Congress of the Communist International. And while there, he and an a Canadian young communist leader, Morris Spector, came across Trotsky's draft program of a critique of the Communist International, which was Trotsky's most decisive intervention into the growing politics of Stalinism, of socialism in one country, as Stalin was articulating it, and the ways in which this was deforming political life inside the Comintern, the way in which instead of committing the Comintern to proletarian internationalism and the class struggle on an international level to create socialist possibility around the world, which is the only thing which could really preserve the gains of the Russian Revolution. Stalin was drawing inward, subordinating the Comintern's theory and practice to the notion that it should defend and solidify socialism in the Soviet Union rather than extend world revolution. And a part of this critique of Trotsky's focused on the errors that the American Communist Party had made, particularly around the whole question of the Farmer Labor Party and cross-class alliances, which Cannon had never been comfortable with, but hadn't really had the kind of insights that Trotsky did that allowed him to see how fundamentally un-Marxian and destined for failure this approach was. And so Cannon began to realize that also that what Stalinism was doing inside the American Party was fomenting and sustaining the factionalism that existed and that had in some senses a natural evolution out of different sort of perspectives and emphases that particular leadership groups cultivated. What Stalin was doing was balancing one faction off against another and playing various factions off against another so that ultimately his own power would be secured and that he wouldn't have rivals in a national section like that of the United States that could actually challenge him effectively. All of this led Cannon to embrace Trotskyism and to begin the process of trying to build a Trotskyist nucleus, first inside the Communist Party, which was very soon scuttled, and Cannon and those who had aligned with him, and even those who refused to basically subordinate themselves to the New York leadership's demand that everyone who had any connection with Cannon renounce that connection. And gradually, Cannon built up an external opposition, and the CP recruited people to that opposition by expelling them and giving them, in some senses, nowhere to go but towards Cannon. At that point, Trotskyists around the world, known as the left opposition, felt that their orientation should be towards the Communist Party, which they still saw as the vanguard, still saw as the home where the most militants and the most revolutionary workers were concentrated. And so over the course of much of the early 1930s, and this was a period of real dog days for the revolutionary left because of the Great Depression, Cannon and others oriented towards trying to win back those elements in the CP who they felt had gone on a wrong Stalinist road towards the true revolutionary politics of the first four congresses of the Communist International, and which they felt were the basis on which Trotskyism was now being organized internationally. Cannon's role over the course of the 1930s was really, again, to try to, in some senses, to reproduce in some ways his caretaker function as someone who could bring together and regroup the revolutionary left, the way that he had in those years from 1919 to 1921, as the Communist Party was being born. And the fruits of this were the birth of the Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist organization that emerged in 1938. But those 10 years from 28 to 38 were momentous ones, which saw Trotskyism emerge from the shadows of the Communist Party. In 1933-34, the International Left Opposition and the American Trotskyist, organized in the Communist League of America, basically came to the conclusion that Stalinism was no longer could no longer be seen as the revolutionary vanguard that had gone off the tracks and could be brought back into a revolutionary fold. Instead, particularly with the events in Germany, where during the most sectarian years of the early 1930s, in the third period, communists isolated themselves and played a role in allowing fascism to come to power. And the social democratic and communist forces that had been so strong in Germany to be dismantled and destroyed. Trotsky at that point said, no, and no longer can we see the Comintern as the sort of end game of revolutionary politics. It is now, in effect, certainly not a revolutionary force, and in fact is functioning increasingly as a counter-revolutionary force. And so the task was then to build independent and new, to reforge and rebuild a new international, the Fourth International. And that's what Cannon dedicated his life to doing, building fusions and entries with other parties, such as the Socialist Party, which was recruiting some young people in the 1930s, to fuse with groups like A.J. Muste's Workers' Party of America, and to lead increasingly important class struggles like the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters strikes, where Cannon's followers among the Minneapolis Teamsters established themselves as the leaders of the most successful and highly significant series of Teamster strikes in 1934 that were in some senses a preface to the 1937 upheavals of the CIO. Those gains were largely undone by state repression in the 1940s, as once again war and repression took their toll on the revolutionary prospects of Cannon and those who aligned with him. Cannon served a jail term in 1945-46, supposedly for treasonous activities and conspiracy to thwart the war effort. A jail term, by the way, that was supported actively by the Communist Party, which would then come under the same assault, the use of the Smith Act, which had convicted the Trotskyists in 1943, and then again in their appeal in 1945, was leveled against the Communist Party in 1949. Cannon's later life continued this attempt to sort of forge and build and sustain the international Trotskyist movement and its largest and most successful section in the United States. But McCarthyism and other developments certainly took their toll. Cannon, by the mid-1950s, had gone through a series of faction fights within the Trotskyist milieu that saw a number of his followers stripped away from him, either to join other groups or to disappear from politics entirely. I think the relevance of Cannon today is that he is a red thread of continuity, and he does show that the possibilities of revolution within the American working class, which is often held up as exceptional and incapable of fomenting revolutionary politics and building a class struggle party. That Cannon, in fact, is dedicated his life to this and was amazingly successful and made a mark beyond the small numbers of Trotskyism. What they accomplished in the 1930s, in some senses, particularly around the Minneapolis strike, was monumental, monumental. And they showed that a leadership, a revolutionary leadership in a non-revolutionary but volatile situation could take the class struggle forward. Before Cannon and his followers in Minneapolis involved themselves in, in the Teamster struggles of 1934, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters at the beginning of that year had no more than 150 members. By the end of that year, after 3 strikes and beating back one of the most recalcitrant employers associations in the United States, and beating back a farmer labor government, as well as the police forces and the most reactionary elements in Minneapolis, local political, municipal politics. Beating them back, they built an organization that had 7,000 members, and they won for them a series of concessions from capitalists and who had been incredibly dug in their refusal to sort of recognize unions and workers' entitlements. That victory then springboarded into an across the road organizing campaign that involved almost all of the Midwestern states, and that boosted the Teamsters membership from about 100,000 to over 400,000. An incredible accomplishment for a group quite small and very much marginalized by the hegemonic forces of the time. So Cannon does show, and today we think of how difficult it is to organize, but how much more difficult was it to organize in 1919 or in 1932 at times of both repression and economic collapse. And what I think Cannon also illuminates is the importance of regrouping the revolutionary left on principled foundations, of building a party, a class struggle party, a proletarian party that has as its purpose the transformation of society and the liberation, not just of the working class, but of all humanity. Cannon lived for that purpose. He dedicated his life to it. He is a red thread of continuity that ran through the American working class experience from the late 19th century right through the 1960s and into his death in the 1970s. His inspiration lives where he is revered, particularly in sections of the revolutionary left in Latin America and in other locales. And he provides lessons. Not that we can apply mechanically and rigidly and unthinkingly to our situation, but a perspective and a willingness to stand firm in the face of so many barriers, a refusal to accommodate what is perhaps one of the most pernicious influences on the left in our time, that of lesser evilism, that we have to bow and scrape before those who have no interest in workers improving their lives, no interest in transforming the sort of hellhole that capitalism has become with its recurring and intensifying crises, but that in order to stave off others who represent the worst possible scenario, we have to sort of accommodate to the lesser evil. I think that's something that Cannon would never have countenanced and never have lived with. And we can learn from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for that very detailed overview of James Cannon's life. I think a lot of us would probably agree with your assessments. For the folks who are in the event, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and I'll read them off here as they come in. You talked about the kind of the split in the IWW over this question of political struggle versus struggle at the point of production, and that still seems like a very pertinent question for modern IWW members. The question of a party and a political struggle I think they're kind of inseparable. Whereas there are folks who, eschew the party and want to portray the struggle at the point of production as a political struggle, which I think in some ways we would agree with, but to them, that's like the only political struggle, right? And so I guess I was maybe a little curious how Cannon saw that. I mean, I'm sure he kind of fell in line with the Bolsheviks there, but
yeah, as I say, that moment of 1914 to 1918 was one that Cannon always said was an eye opener for him. Certainly he would have never had any problem realizing that the struggle at the point of production is a political struggle. But the notion of the Wobblies that you could create the new society in the shell of the old by struggling only at the point of production was for him one that by 1914, with the declaration of war, it really revealed to Cannon that there are decisive elements of capitalism that are orchestrated by the state, which exists outside of, but of course not, separable from the point of production. But nevertheless, there are elements of the state that are outside of the narrow understanding of the productive forces. And that state is decisive in the development of those productive forces. But it's also decisive in the development of capitalism's responses to crises, of which imperialism, colonialism are foundational, right? As long as capitalism remains the sort of economic, mode of organization, you are going to have an inevitable decline in the rate of profit, as in particular, enclosed national boundaries, overproduction creates gluts, creates, market instabilities, which creates economic crises, which throws the masses of people into, dealing with unemployment, inflation, economic stagnation, etc. And the way out of that for capitalism has always been colonization and imperialism. And ultimately that leads to war. So if you're going to fight those kinds of fights, if you're going to challenge capitalism in a holistic way, you need the simultaneous struggles at the point of production against capital per se in the economic realm. But you also need a political organization to actually fight the political fights that are going to inevitably, happen outside of that realm, but intimately connected to it. And also, how are you going to fight the repression that is going to come down on the basically the collective head of the working class if it is mobilizing against capital at the point of production? And the war revealed that. I mean, the three, for instance, criminal syndicalist trials of 1917 to 1918, they did not have a common strategy in terms of how to oppose the state's repression. In California, I believe they mounted a silent trial. That is, they refused to speak. In Chicago, they had a different approach, and in Wheatland, they had another approach. Well, Cannon thought that, what we need is a coordination, and only a political party can provide that kind of coordination. It isn't to say that you need to lapse into the parliament, what Lenin called parliamentary cretinism, or, which was so evident in American bourgeois politics, a kind of bureaucratized party machine, that the Democrats and Tammany Hall kind of epitomized. Cannon knew that milieu well. He had a bit of a introduction to the Pendergrass machine in Kansas City, and certainly that's not his idea of what a party and a political struggle is. But he knew that you had to, like Vincent St. John, his attitude towards young comrades who came in the communist movement was send them out into the working class, send them out into the class struggle. Give them seasoning. Let them learn the ropes. They will learn how to organize strikes. They will learn how to fight bosses. They will learn how to organize meetings. At a certain point, though, when those people had learned what they could learn from that, they also had to be integrated into a party apparatus where they could learn other skills and perhaps engage in more umbrella-like activities of coordination of working class struggles. So, Cannon never relinquished what was best in the Wobblies. And I don't think any American left that is regrouped will ever be able to actually bypass the incredibly significant contribution that the Wobblies have made to the American revolutionary tradition. But Cannon saw it as limited. It needed to go to another stage too.
Which was, I guess the reason for that kind of split between the pro-Russian Revolution IWW members and those who were hostile to it. But, Cannon and Haywood, it seemed like they constantly were trying to bring the IWW into the fold of the Communist International and advocating that, this is actually going to strengthen the Union if the IWW is affiliated to the Comintern, and trying to win those folks over. It seemed like they had some success in the 1920s, at least, by removing some anti-communist leaders in the Wobblies, and keeping them from, posting like anti-communist screeds in the IWW paper. I think it was the Industrial Pioneer, I think was the paper at the time where that was going on. That is interesting to think about, obviously not seeing the rise of Stalin within the Communist International as like a no longer a revolutionary force, right? But at the same time, still maintaining the Soviet defensism line against, say, like Shachtman, right, who kind of went the way of, I guess, Lovestone, where they saw the Soviet Union as actually counter-revolutionary and on par with the rest of the imperialist world. Is that?
Yeah, well, you touch on a number of different points there. There were a number of Wobblies who gravitated towards the Communist Party. I mean, after all, John Reed was one of them, right? And if he'd have died, if he hadn't have died when he did, he would have been probably, I think, he would definitely have been in the Communist International. I mean, he was a key figure in it, and had been but had been a figure, of strong support for the Wobblies as well. I mean, agitators like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn went from the Wobblies to, there was a figure named Harrison George who was, gravitated from the Wobblies along with Cannon, and many, many others did. The whole process of regrouping the revolutionary left is a protracted process. And what's very interesting, yeah, there was a firm anti-communist element in the IWW as time went on. But what Cannon was able to do when he was expelled from the Comintern, and when the Stalinists mounted thuggish, gangster-like attacks on, the early Trotskyist forums, who did Cannon turn to? He went to his old IWW friends, who mounted defense guards that stood in front of the podium to repulse the Stalinists when they tried to attack Cannon. Cannon was always, I think he regretted the fact that he couldn't recruit Vincent St. John, which he tried to recruit him, and that he regretted the fact that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, remained in the Stalinist movement and became a sort of a vociferous defender of it. But he maintained close connections with people like Carlo Tresca, an anarchist and a wobbly, who up until his assassination in 1943, I think, was very friendly always with Cannon. So there was this notion, even as Cannon was building the Trotskyist movement, that the best elements of the Wobblies could still be aligned in United Front activities. United Fronts don't mean, unlike popular fronts, that you submerge your own politics. But you could march together in the cause of a single struggle, carrying your own separate banners and hoping to win people to your cause. And, that cause had to be a principled one. And Cannon maintained those principles at great cost personally. I mean, his best friend in the American Communist Party was Bill Dunn, who he always regretted he couldn't recruit to Trotskyism, and who stayed in the movement, in the Communist Party until he was drummed out of it, in about 1946, 47, I think. And Max Shachtman, who had, they had gone through much together. But in the end, and here's where Soviet defensism is important. I mean, Shachtman relinquished that. And in relinquishing that, Cannon could see that and Morris Spector could see this as well. He was on a downward trajectory where ultimately Shachtman would embrace the Bay of Pigs as a sort of clandestine American invasion of Cuba as a positive. Because if you get, there's a delicate balance between, Stalinism and Stalinophobia. And the phobia against Russia, which grew in the Cold War years and which Shachtman ended up embracing, pushed him in the direction of being, basically one of the worst anti-communist elements in the CIO, in the AFL-CIO. And again, Cannon, however difficult it was, maintained an entirely different approach.
I think it gets back to the phrase you're using about Cannon's consistency over his political life, with that red thread, and not zigzagging like Haywood Foster, who decided to stay in the Communist Party and kind of said, well, he was always sort of tailing those in power, whether it was Gompers and the AFL, to try to garner some support to maybe initiate some organizing campaign, and versus his line Cannon's line, it seemed like he was always willing to fight for political independent principles, and of the idea of boring from within, because Foster famously gets a lot of credit for that idea of boring from within, right? He draws his inspiration of going in the reactionary trade unions to revolutionize them from his tour in Europe, seeing syndicalists in Europe doing this effectively. And, but again, Cannon's criticism seems to be that he took that line to a certain degree that was at least convenient for the time for Stalin's leadership, until like maybe the third period, where all of a sudden they switch gears over to like a dual unionism line, which Foster was always so hostile against.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just interesting seeing that it's like they both upheld that boring from within line. The Comintern adopted that as the official line with for the communist parties and the trade union movement. But it obviously manifested in different ways, through like the Teamsters of the Communist League and their role in boring from within the Teamsters there versus kind of tailing the labor bureaucrats within the AFL that, the Communist Party was doing under Foster's leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, you cut out for me at some point in there, but Foster is a fascinating case, and Cannon always felt that Foster's case was a very tragic one, because he was as a mass leader within the working class. Cannon viewed him as basically unrivaled. He had a capacity, I think, as a revolutionary to galvanize workers in ways that I think we in our time find almost difficult to comprehend. But it was a different culture, and a figure like Foster could really make an impact. But as you said, Foster had sort of made his accommodations with power, and the tragedy that Cannon identified in Foster was twofold. As a mass leader, he was too willing to make accommodations to the AFL bureaucracy. Now, that garnered him a certain stature, but it also limited ultimately what he was capable of doing. And then he followed, when he became a more political figure as the trade union leader within the CP, he was always willing to basically accommodate to the Stalinist leadership, which of course, destroyed him in some ways. Foster had a kind of breakdown around 1929, 30. He felt the leadership should have gone to him of the CP, and indeed it should have. I mean, Browder was kind of this gray figure, more of a clerk, many in the movement thought, than a worker. Foster had, just his credentials and his stature in the working class and in radical circles far outstripped anything Browder could have. But Stalin knew that Browder was pliable. He knew that Foster represented a certain threat. He wasn't going to get rid of Foster because he was too important, but he wasn't going to let him rise to the stature of a leader that could actually pose some, threat to Stalin's ultimate leadership over in the American Party. And so, the tragedy of Foster is that he was basically, kept on a leash for the remainder of his time, in the Communist Party. And what a waste of a proletarian leader, one who came out of even more impoverished and difficult circumstances than Cannon, and who knew intimately the kind of, the nature and the impulses of the American worker, which is something that people like Shachtman always said that Cannon had as well. I mean, he had that, they both had that capacity. the dual tragedy there is that Cannon accommodated, or pardon me, Foster accommodated. Cannon fought the principled fight, but in fighting the principled fight, he always had to then, you know, be fighting not only the bosses and the state and the reformists, but also the one contingent that was hegemonic on the American left, the Communist Party. It's amazing that he managed to do what he managed to do when you think about it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I would imagine you're familiar with Jacob Zumov's book on the Communist International and U.S. communism, and it seemed like from his portrayal of things, anyways, that because of how fractious the U.S. communist movement was, they really relied on the Comintern to unify the U.S. communist movement. And like you're saying, how Cannon had such a distaste of it, that folks just sort of wanted that unity, and in a way, it almost seemed like it provided space for Stalinism to emerge because of, you know, um, they were just getting issued top-down orders from the Comintern once Stalin was in power, right? Rather than being seen as a space for debate from the national parties with the Comintern and having an exchange and whatnot. And so I don't know if you maybe would agree with that assessment or.
Well, I'd certainly agree that Cannon wanted unity, and in fact, for a brief period, he tried to mount what he called a faction against factionalism, in which he said basically, our faction, our group, isn't going to vote along factional lines. We're only going to vote along the lines that we think are correct, regardless of who else we're blocking with. And we're going to push the notion of trying to elevate ourselves above factionalism. The problem was it was very difficult to do, and particularly with the maneuverings of just a really repugnant figure like Lovestone, who was
Peters.
yeah. But to give you an example, an interesting example of Foster and Cannon's differences, and they do reflect, I think, a certain mechanical nature in Foster, and reveal a more sort of a more I don't know what to call it, a more creative element among Cannon. Foster, as you said, it came out of his time as a syndicalist, and then his work in the steelworkers strike of 1918. But he was the most fervent opponent of dual unionism in the communist movement. Now, Cannon said, I never used that word dual unionism. I didn't like it. As a Wobbly, I didn't like it. And Cannon's IWW, time in the IWW, and his commitment to it, I think, were much greater than Foster's, who was heralded as an IWW member, but had a very short moment, really, that he was involved in it. But what Cannon said was, look, the Communist International is right. When there are established unions on the ground, the notion that you should then set up an alternative union, a dual union, is probably going to be a dead end. And in fact, that was a big part of what Cannon and the early Trotskyists opposed in the third period, when the Comintern's position on dual unionism shifted away from, Leninist understandings of united fronts and boring from within to red unionism at all costs, break from the social fascists, build red revolutionary unions. Well, Cannon agreed with that, agreed that, that was a that was a dead end in the third period, and that you had to be in the AFL, even if you were aspiring to build CIO-like, unions. And the Minneapolis Teamster strike was a reflection of the gains that could be made when you had that approach. There was no more conservative, ossified, bureaucratized union than the Teamsters, in 1933, 34. But a Trotskyist leadership, you know, won a rank and file and built a union in opposition to that. But what Cannon also said is, where there's no AFL union on the ground, or where the AFL has basically, marginalized and isolated itself and refused to organize the unorganized, then by all means, a dual union. And in this, he then had some respect, particularly retroactively, for Weisbord's attempt, Weisbord's struggles in Passaic in 1926-27, where Jacob Zumoff, who you mentioned for his book on the communists, has just written a good book on the Passaic strike, which shows what could be done when a revolutionary leadership, Weisbord was in the Communist Party then, can move into a situation where the established unions have basically said, to hell with it, we're not going to organize these people, they're unorganized. And the tragedy of the Communist Party was it basically, although Weisbord was a member and accomplished so much there, they basically cut him loose and cut a deal with the AFL union, which was a reactionary union that had basically had no inclination or interest in organizing those workers. Weisbord organized them and then found himself basically given a turf by both the employers and the CP.
Did did Cannon, was he aware of the workers' opposition, or prior to the struggles in the Sixth Congress, the Comintern?
Um, uh, Subsequently, yes, of course, to some extent, but at the time, not really, not much. I mean, very little. When Cannon embraced Trotskyism in late 28 and early 29, he had never met Trotsky. He'd never corresponded with Trotsky. They didn't have a lot of correspondence with left opposition groups in Europe. It was it was really and Cannon himself says this, I thought, here I am. I'm a member of, I'm going to give up my swivel chair, his chair in the office of the CP, my stenographers, my secretary, this and that, to basically build a movement on a shoestring. They had nothing. Their early days were days of impoverishment. They operated out of their own apartments for most of the time. They put out the first issue of the Militant late in 1928 on nothing. They had been, let's not forget, Aburn, Shackman, Cannon, Rose Carstner. They had been professional revolutionaries on the CP's payroll. That ended. That ended. They had nothing. No jobs, no incomes. It was difficult. Very difficult. And they were vilified. They were vilified by their former comrades.
Yeah. Well, I would think, I'm not going to deny that it was difficult, obviously. But I also think, despite, contending with Stalinism, the Soviet Union still existed, right? And there was the Russian Revolution, and even with Stalinism as a dominant force in that movement, it seems like workers were still more inspired by the events of the Russian Revolution. Whereas today, there is no world headquarters of revolution to draw support from to jumpstart because if had the Comintern not been established, there probably wouldn't have been a lot of communist parties around the world formed. And it seems today we're just kind of languishing over that. Maybe some folks look towards China as a model, but obviously there's no Comintern they're running, and they don't really have a desire to do that. Or you have like maybe gravitating towards some like nationalist force somewhere around the world, some elusive revolutionary force in the world today. And I think in some ways that actually makes it more difficult for us than these prior generations who at least had the Soviet Union to look to as a source of inspiration.
Yeah. No, I get that. It's a dialectical balance, right? I mean, for what I suppose what I'd start out by saying is, yes, there was still the example of the Russian Revolution and Stalin for workers to look to when Cannon was, struggling to break out of Stalinism and to create, to get back to revolutionary first principles and get back to the possibilities of building an international movement capable of, leading revolution inside the capitalist nations of the world. And so, yes, workers could look to the Soviet Union. But for Cannon and the attempt to build an alternative, that made life in 1929 to 30 incredibly difficult. And it was further complicated by the fact that at right the moment that he broke from Stalinism and arguably was putting forward left-wing revolutionary perspectives, what did the Comintern do? It put forward the third period, this ultra-left, which seemed to many workers to say, okay, well, they really are the bastion of revolutionary. Cannon and others were, threading the very difficult needle of saying, the Comintern has undergone a Stalinization. It's no longer a revolutionary force. We are putting forward the revolutionary program that actually can win. And then, workers who perhaps weren't, workers say, well, okay, you're saying you're the revolution, but, they're saying build revolutionary unions, create red unions, blood will flow in the street. It's going to be our revolution now. It took a while for, it to sink in that this ultra-leftism and sectarianism wasn't going to actually, do the job. And yes, we don't have that beacon on the Revolutionary Hill anymore. And added to that is the ideological residue of decades of denunciation of, the possibility of workers' revolution and socialism, which has registered in working class circles, and among, in the labor movement, but also among just, rank and file members of unions and those who aren't organized. On the other hand, and this is another reason why a political party and a regroupment of the left is so essential, you could also say, just impressionistically, that if you looked at young people on a whole series of questions, young people today are far more progressive and open to issues than they would have been in the 1920s, right? Around racism, around homophobia, around misogyny. Even if what's incredible is if you just look back to the Sanders campaign of a few years ago, where socialism was sort of, all of a sudden, it wasn't such a dirty word. Now, there were all kinds of problems and critiques I make of that, but all I'm saying is the sensibilities of younger people are more radical and progressive now than they've been at any time in the last 100 years, I'd say. And yet, the revolutionary left, I would argue, is weaker now than it has ever been. Weaker and more, I won't say it's more fragmented because it's always been fragmented, but it's weaker. A lot of those fragments have disappeared or imploded. A lot of them have been repressed, you know. I mean, you just look at what happened to a group like the Black Panthers. So I think one can be hopeful about the prospects for the present, but also um, cognizant of the difficult uphill climb the revolutionary left has to make to rebuild the structures and institutions and political presence that really it once held in American life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you were saying, like communism, going through the public school system, it's just drilled in your head that this was a failed project, the god that failed, right? Um, and it's just anytime you try to bring up socialism or Marxism, people will just point to North Korea or Venezuela as, you know, this is the logical consequences of communism and you know, mass starvation and death, and it's the worst alternative to, you know, humanist capitalism or whatever, capitalist democracy. Um, so yeah, I mean, on the one hand, younger generations are not as imbued with that anti-communism as older generations who, you know, did grow up during at least the latter parts of the Soviet Union. Um, but then on the other, like, this question of the party is so important because there is no leadership that is actually providing guidance to the youth. So it's like the left itself is disoriented, the youth is disoriented. There's no real direction with it. The ruling class has caught up on all these social issues to where now they embrace anti-racism and pro-LGBTQ positions, and you have a whole new industry through the nonprofits that have emerged to ensure, you know, how there is equity and uh, diversity in the workplace, and you know we have DEI chiefs now, and so it's almost like the ruling class has outmaneuvered the working class on these issues that they aren't inherently like revolutionary issues anymore. Like I think it is a good development that we understand these forms of discrimination are bad, but nothing is really touching the wage labor capital distinction there, which is like the fundamental thing holding all of this together. Um, so yeah, it just seems we're in a very bad position of just disorientation, and a lot of that has to do with the lack of the party. Even though you have several sects in the U.S. that claim to be the party, right? And so it's, you know, how to move past that point, how to, obviously a combination of splits and fusions, regroupment, as you say, coming from different tendencies or different organizations. And I would like to think our caucus can play a role in at least broaching these subjects amongst our union membership. And I think it's something that should be broached in all unions amongst membership, but then having like a united program to do that, even though we don't even have, you know, a workers' party that's principled in the U.S. that exists currently.
Yes, I mean, I think that, you know, groups like yours have a vital role to play in this regroupment process, and that's to me that's central because, for instance, in the current situation in the U.S., this is the lesser evilism that I referred to. I mean, you know, nobody wants Trump, but you know, when you look at Harris and what she's offering, I mean, you know, I have trouble believing that the long-term threat to any revolutionary prospects of, you know, sustained working class transformation in a society like the United States, I would see Harris as more of a threat than Trump in the long term. You know, I mean, Trump bodes, uh, you know, as I say, nobody wants Trump, but how many people, because Trump is so repugnant, are willing to throw their towel in with Harris and offer no criticism. I mean, the Harris-Biden, I mean, for a labor leader like the UAW head to say Harris is one of us and to champion Biden, how quickly people forget. I mean, Biden's, I think, approach to labor can be summed up in a sentence: break a railway strike in 2022, and then march on a picket line for the UAW in 2023. Well, if that makes you a friend of labor, then the bar has been set pretty low. And yet, so many progressives, so many young people are going to throw, Now, it remains to be seen. Maybe some of the young people so galvanized by the war in Gaza can't go that direction. Although I think with Biden they wouldn't have. With Harris they will, I think. But that's a prediction, not a certainty.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point of debate within our union, because in our Constitution, it prohibits any affiliation or endorsements of any political party of any kind, and maintains this, like idealist notion of we're like no politics in the union. Yet, like you just said, there's really only two options people are seeing electorally, and they're going to go towards one of those two unless you have another option, which would again necessitates the question of a working class party that could actually contend with that. And it's just like, I mean, this was the critique, I think, of Lenin and others, was that if you refuse to participate in it, you're basically just handing the whole terrain over to the bourgeoisie. You're not contending with them at all. And I feel like that critique has some traction, but it's also just we aren't facilitating enough discussion within our union around these questions as well. And yeah, I mean that's one of the things we're trying to do.
Yeah.
With our caucus.
I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to say that no political party in existence at the present moment should or could command our support. But we welcome, efforts to regroup the left so that there is a political party that actually, in principled ways, supports the class struggle initiatives that the IWW has always been associated with. And indeed, there was a time in the IWW when people had two red cards. They had the Socialist Party card and the IWW card. Now, the political party, the Socialist Party, did its best to destroy that by, getting rid of Haywood and company on the grounds that they advocated sabotage, which was a pretty, weak read to, somebody who's actually willing to say we are willing to fight against capitalism in all kinds of ways. It reflected the dominance of the right wing in the Socialist Party. But that's not to say that any and all parties would, embrace that. And anyway, people must be getting your audience must be getting tired here.
Yeah. I think we've probably gotten enough done here. I feel this was very substantial, and again, really appreciate you taking the time to present and answer these questions. For the folks still on board, we're gonna jump from this event towards reading Cannon's. Was it like written in the 1950s? His kind of summation of the IWW. So that's gonna be our next.
Yeah. It wasn't just titled the IWW, The Great Anticipation? Yeah. No, that will give you a good insight into both his, long-standing, lifelong appreciation of the IWW and his sense of, why he himself chose to go a different route, but not breaking from the tradition,
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, and hopefully we can stay in touch, and we'll keep you up to date on developments with the
Yeah.
caucus.
No, I'd be delighted to learn how you're doing, and the best of luck. And thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, have a good night. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.